Welcome to the Objectivism Book Study. I'm Cody Leibold. This is a series of discussions of Leonard Peikoff's book, Objectivism, the Philosophy of Ayn Rand. We call it OPAR. We're discussing it from a Christian perspective, and we meet on Zoom on Saturday mornings, 9 a.m. to 10 a.m. Eastern. You can register at christianintellectual.com/objectivism. This week the reading was Chapter 1, pages 12 to 16, Causality as a Corollary of Identity, and pages 17 to 23. Existence as possessing primacy over consciousness. This is a amazingly dense section, many implications on whether it is rational to believe in God. We as Christians believe in God, and objectivists don't, and so their understanding of many of these concepts differs from ours. We're going to be discussing that, as well as their idea of what is this primacy of existence theory versus the primacy of consciousness theory, and how does it work out in the US society? How does it work out in churches today? There is actually a lot of this going on that we need to be discussing. All right, we've actually, before we started the recording, we made a list of several topics that we really want to make sure to hit. Nature and things having a nature and identity, and therefore there's a connection between that and cause and effect. And then the question of whether the universe itself can be caused or whether the universe just is eternal. And there's some definitional issues there. I'm going to start with that definitional issue. I think, Jacob, if you would like, if you're available to come on right now, Jacob Brunton, could you express your perspective on this topic of the universe and the implications of this chapter on the existence of God?
Yeah, so objectivists, so let me back up and say that I understand the rationale behind what they're doing when they talk about the universe this way, right? So when they talk about the universe, they mean everything that exists, right? And if that's what you mean by the universe, then it makes sense to say that there's nothing outside of it, right? Because it's just definitionally, the universe is all that exists. That means that there's nothing outside of it, which means that there's nothing outside of it that could create it or cause it, right? So, but the problem is that that's not typically what the concept of universe has meant in philosophical history, especially when you're interacting with theists, right? Which they are trying to do in this chapter. Because in the context of someone who affirms theism, the concept of universe refers to the physical universe. It refers to all that exists in physical reality, or all physical things that exist, or all material things that exist. You want to use the concept of material rather than physical. And when you're using it that way, there is no inherent contradiction between saying, yes, the universe is all of material reality, and there is something which exists outside of material reality which caused it or created it to be what it is, right? They want to sort of conflate those two meanings. They want to say, well, if the universe is all that exists, then nothing could exist outside of it, and so you are violating the axiom of existence. You are stepping outside of existence when you affirm the, and here's the giveaway term, existence of God, right? Theism affirms the existence of God. We affirm that there is an entity called God which exists. The fact that he happens to be conscious doesn't negate the fact that we're affirming that he exists. And he exists separate from the universe, separate from the physical universe, and has caused and created things within the physical universe.
Yeah, you can see, just to tag on to what Jacob said, you can see him do this equivocation, or really it's a false equivalency, because he's using two different words and then acting like he's established that they're the same thing. That's why I mentioned the third full paragraph on page 17. He says, one may no more ask who is responsible for natural law, which amounts to asking who caused causality, than one may ask who created the universe. The answer to both questions is the same. Existence exists. Well, you see him say, who created the universe? Well, existence just exists. Well, that's begging the question in the technical sense. He's saying existence whatever exists exists. So therefore, no one created the universe. And I think that's an example of how he is making a false equivalency between the material world plus consciousness of humans and existence as a whole. But it is worth pointing out that he doesn't just believe that only matter exists. He affirms that consciousness exists, and it's not strictly dependent on matter. So even right there, he has to get out of the accusations of irrationality from the materialists, which we would affirm he's right in doing. But it's worth pointing out that he already affirmed something besides matter. So why draw the line there arbitrarily?
There's one point that Jacob was making just a minute ago that I thought we might want to just mention for the sake of anybody who's well read in R.C. Sproul and classic Christian theology and philosophy, is we actually have a different way of discussing existence historically within Christian thought than the way that is currently being used by Leonard Peikoff, and that's the common way of speaking about it today among the mainstream of academics. The idea of existence itself, if you asked R.C. Sproul, does God exist? He would say God does not exist, because he's using a slightly different definition of that word. And he would say that God is being, esse, or whatever the word is in Latin. And he would say that whatever it is that God is so different from everything else in the universe that we are going to draw a line between there's God who is just being, and then there is everything else which has its being as a result of God. And exist, if you actually look at the etymology of the word, it means that the thing that has its being out of something else. It's coming out of something else. Mm-hmm. Anyway, I'm not saying that this is going to be useful to the objectivists necessarily, but from our point of view, we have a different way of discussing these terms. Like, for example, the universe, like Jacob said, the universe has not been taken typically to mean everything including the creator. It's been taken to mean everything that was created. We say the creation. And there's a lot of situations like this within the discourse between Christians and objectivists, where we're going to look at the terms that they're using, and we're going to say that's not what we meant. Like, for example, this question of, is it possible for God to make a mountain that's so big that God cannot move it? And then they'll ridicule us and they'll say, well, your God is supposed to be omnipotent, but he can't do this. And we'll say, well, have you bothered to learn what we mean by the term omnipotent, and so on? We don't necessarily mean that he can do things that result in a contradiction. And then they ridicule our God as being infinite. And they say, well, infinite just means that it's no specific thing. And they say, well, there's such thing as a mathematical infinity. But mathematical infinity, and they discuss this in this book, is the idea that you could, in theory, add numbers to numbers to numbers, and that there's no necessary limit to when you would have to stop. But we could come back and we could say, our own theologians, Isaac Watts, for example, in his book on logic, has said the exact same thing that Aristotle has said about numbers, that infinity is a hypothetical concept. And he's addressed the question of, when we apply infinity as a concept to God, are we doing it in the sense of saying that God goes on literally forever in all directions? Is that the claim that we're making about God, that he's physically extends in all directions forever without ever stopping? That's not what we're claiming. And likewise, we're not claiming that God can sin or that God can lie. There are limits on what God can do. And although we have to speak very carefully about anything that would put a limit on God, because he's so different from everything else in the universe, in the created universe. And we want to speak reverently because we don't know the answers to all the things that may or may not limit God. Many of these critiques that the objectivists raise, they simply come from a place of not having studied the system that they're critiquing. Any reaction to anything that I raised? Several different thought threads in there.
Let me just clarify real fast, because it is important to point out, we do agree with the fundamental principle that Peikoff and Rand are trying to teach here, that existence exists, that existence is primary. As an analogy, think about the difference that the distinction that they make between the metaphysical and the man-made, right? That they've got a category for certain things that exist in themselves that are just sort of necessarily existent, and then a separate category for things which are contingent upon men's choices because of the unique nature of man, right? So they've got that distinction already. We're simply making one further distinction, which is between that which is God made and that which isn't, that which just is God's being, that which just is, right? So rather than referring to all of the physical universe as that which simply is without prior cause, we're referring to God as that thing which simply is without prior cause. And that makes the physical universe something which is apart from our consciousness, but not apart from God's consciousness.
Now, this consciousness distinction, consciousness versus existence, one of the critiques that we will hear is that the Christians believe that God's consciousness is primary over everything. And so it's like a polemical point that they're trying to make, because this isn't essential to their view, but they want to look at our view and they want to analyze our view and say, this is why we disagree with the Christians. And the trouble with this claim of theirs is that we actually believe that God is pure being. We believe that he actually does exist as well. And we're not saying that, because God wishes something, that, his consciousness is this magical thing. And we're not saying we give him the status of having all power because he is this consciousness. He is the being, and he also is a person, which means he has consciousness, and his being and his consciousness they're not divisible from one another, just like they're not divisible in us either. And so, these objections, they're pretty petty. Okay, I see a comment from Andrew. He says, at some point, I would like to talk about Peikoff's concept of causality. Yeah, let's go ahead, Andrew, let's go that direction.
I don't think either time that I've read this chapter, I might have read it 3 times, that I've fully grasped what Peikoff is trying to say distinctively about causality from an objectivist perspective. He defines causality as entities acting. And he draws a distinction between the typical thought of, he compares his view to the popular view, or the commonplace view of billiard balls. He said something like, let me try to find it right here. For example, the motion of one billiard ball, or he says, by the same token, the causal link does not relate to actions. Since the Renaissance, it has been common for philosophers to speak as though actions directly cause other actions, bypassing entities altogether. For example, the motion of one billiard ball striking a second is commonly said to be the cause of the motion of the second, the implication being that we can dispense with the balls. The motions by themselves become the cause of other motions. This idea is senseless. Motions do not act, they are actions. It is entities which act and cause. And so his point is that causality is entities acting. And I don't think that I understand that. I think that can kind of see somewhat of a distinction that he's drawing, but I definitely don't grasp what it is he's saying causality is. So maybe someone who has a firmer grasp on that can elucidate.
Well, he explains his point by pointing out that a billiard ball hitting a billiard ball has one effect, whereas a bubble hitting a bubble has a different effect. And so it's the nature of the thing that causes the kind of action. That I'm not sure, does that clear it up, or do you have an expanded question for that?
It definitely, I can see part of what he's saying, in that the nature of the thing acting is going to be a necessary component of the action, but it still seems like some prior action. When we say what caused this, like when I say what caused this to drop, I know he's not saying this, but this is what his view is in my head. It's like, well, it's a pen, it's a marker, that's what it does. It acts, it does that. It's like, but when I ask why, and in my mind, implicitly, I'm saying what state of affairs came onto this entity. Now, I accept what he's saying, that if this was a helium balloon, it would do something different. But I think that inherent in the question why, or what caused it, is what other things besides the entity influenced it to do this thing. And it seems like he wants to only focus on the entity.
I think that's a different question.
He seems to leave out the force, that acted upon the object or the entity, right? That the billiard ball just kind of its own accord decided to move and strike the other billiard ball to cause the result, as opposed to, yes, a billiard ball being acted upon by an outside force would produce a different result from an egg or a soap bubble, but you still need both the billiard ball and the outside force that acts upon it to cause that reaction.
I think
Peikoff and Rand both affirm that both are at play. Peikoff is just zooming in on the identity or the nature of the thing in question, or really the identity or nature of the things in question, right? Because whenever we talk about causality, especially with inanimate objects, right, when we're taking man out of the picture, which is what he's doing here, sort of, you're talking about one or more objects interacting with each other, and the nature of each plays into the type of action that's going to result, right? The causality at play. So I think they would both affirm that, or they would affirm both of those aspects, but they're zooming in on the nature issue because so many philosophers seem to that's what they're saying anyways, that it seems like so many philosophers seem to have lost sight of the issue of the natures of things involved because they focus so much on the action as such, and almost forgotten about the fact that you need to take into account the natures of the things involved here.
Yeah, if I could summarize his point, it's he wants you to take his advice. His advice is remember that these are entities that are acting, and don't forget the entities. If you do forget the entities, then you get a problem like you see lately in the discussions about inflation. I don't know if you guys have been following, the news lately about how inflation is so bad in the U.S. and the reasons why. And a lot of times the discussions that I hear from people that are political moderates or leftists about why inflation is happening is framed in terms of, well, this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened, and they never take it back to who initiated that change. Why did the change begin in the first place? Who did it? What are the facts involved? Like, for example, how much money is there actually in the system right now? And who put it there? And how did they put it there? These are the kinds of questions that you would be looking at if you wanted to know the causes of things. Whereas if you're just interested in jumping in midstream, like a lot of analysis is, you're going to see, well, this price went up and therefore this price went up. And that's an analysis that is looking only at one action and then another action and then another action. So, I mean, that's just one example that came to my mind when I was reading this section was there's different styles of analysis, and he's just giving you advice. All right, let's go to some.
Let me just add one thing to that. I think what I heard Andrew saying was two different questions, and that's what and why. And I don't think Peikoff is trying to answer the question why. He's only trying to answer the question what. What acted upon what? And I think when it comes to the law of causality, you only have entities acting on entities. So why is the billiard ball moving? Well, we're not concerned with why it's moving, but what moved it. So it could have been, the ceiling fan dropped on the billiard ball and that caused it to move. Or it could have been a person striking the ball. And I think you eventually get to the question why first after you've asked the questions of what. Because once you've asked the questions of what, you make these observations, and then you begin to form identifications which speak to the nature of things involved. And the nature of things involved will help you formulate the answer to why.
Let's
think
go
I'm good.
to, let me ask, can I read this from Jacob Karn? Jacob, is it Karn? Okay, he said, I second Andrew. I have questions on how to close the objectivist system, or how close the objectivist system is to the classical Christian theist system with divine simplicity, Thomist metaphysics, act and potency, fourfold causality, etc. Jacob, would you like to, you can go on camera if you want and elaborate on your question, or anybody that has a thought on it can jump in.
Well, sure. I'm curious because, and it seems like Peikoff in this book is talking about how abstraction, like specifically knowledge, you could say, beginning in the senses, terminating in the intellect, is like one of the classical ways that a lot of philosophers and theists have talked about epistemology. And I'm coming to this book. I'm not as familiar with Rand as I am with Thomas, or Thomistic thought, or just the classical Christian theist system. And so I was just having questions as I was reading. I was unsure of how influenced Rand was by, having an understanding of fourfold causality, the distinction, you could say, between essence and existence. As we would say, it isn't a human being's, essence to exist, in the sense of our existence is our essence. We would posit, as Christians, that, it's God whose essence is his existence is his essence. And so I just had some questions on how she distinguishes that, as well as how she talks about, abstraction, kind of in forming these, I don't know, it was kind of interesting on how she talked about how we view entities and how we abstract, certain, how we abstract the entity or the essence of that entity in our mind. I'm just kind of curious on how her whole system relates to that, and how she views, efficient causality, formal, specifically in this sense, the distinction between, matter and form. Does she have a distinction, between that, like, and it kind of relates to the whole idea of, does existence precede essence, or, does your essence precede, your existence?
Yeah, let me give a quick answer to that, is that Thomas was one of her favorite philosophers. She's quite studied in Aristotle and in Thomas. And she said that there were only three good philosophers in history, and it was Aquinas, and it was Aristotle, and it was Ayn Rand. Just to give you an idea, that's how much she thought of Thomas. But when it comes to this use of essence, she disagreed with Thomas, and she disagreed with Aristotle. And the book to describe that is her book, Introduction to Objectivist Epistemology. And that is, she used the term essence not as a metaphysical category, but only as an epistemological one. Jacob, does that help at all? You want to follow up on that?
I think that pretty much answers. I could definitely tell in the reading that there was definitely a distinction between what I'm reading from this book and then what I'm reading in other sources on Thomas's, sort of stream of thought. And so I just thought, I know that I looked into the history of Rand's, influence, and she said she was very influenced from Thomas. And so I was wondering if having that, background in, Thomas's, Thomist metaphysics and epistemology, if that would, kind of line up when I'm reading this, I'd be able to be like, oh yeah, that came from that. But I guess that she kind of, appropriated some maybe terms or concepts while maybe did her own little spin on how it would be explained. So
yes, I think that she saw herself as cleaning up errors that Thomas had made, and excuse me, she saw herself as moving forward some of the goals that Thomas had. Like she would sympathize with the goal of the realists, and she was trying to offer her unique solution to the problems that she thought that they were not able to solve. And that whole discussion of the relationship between objectivism and Thomism, one of the best resources I could recommend is Leonard Peikoff has a history of philosophy course. Andrew Boone is going through it right now, and you're going to hear in every minute detail what objectivists think about Aristotle's system and about Thomas. So that would be the place to go. But I don't think that they always understood the way Christians intended certain ideas. And I don't think that in their polemical approach against Christianity, I don't think that they're always as highly as informed as they should be. I don't want to derogate what they're doing, but many times as I was reading this chapter today, it's just, that's a really good point, and now you're using it in a way that I don't think is quite reasonable. You know, that's my overall thought. All right, let's move on to some other topics that we had listed. So one that I saw was the undeclared civil war in the mind, that says that that there's consciousness has primacy over existence. And so Randy, would you like to express that question and maybe lead us into a discussion on that topic?
Sure. I think, this is kind of a carryover from last week's discussion. At the end of the reading, Peikoff introduced the concept of primitives not being aware of these axiomatic principles of reality versus, those of us today who can lean on Aristotle and others who have made us aware of these things. So, where the primitives acted in a way according to the fact that they didn't understand reality, perhaps those of us today are taking a different perspective. It's more of a declared civil war in our own minds, that we do understand these things or have the ability or capability to understand them, but we still act in a way that's inconsistent from reality, and we don't have a cohesive epistemological structure, if you will.
One reaction to that point would just be to say Rand is probably looking at the development of human history more the way that an evolutionist would. And from that point of view, I think there's some chronological snobbery going on, because I don't necessarily believe that Nebuchadnezzar's reasoning capacities were inferior just because he lived before the time of Aristotle. Now, what we have after Aristotle is a more systematized approach. And it's great that we can recognize that we have a more systematized approach. But now that said, Rand, in most of her writings, she has a very low opinion of what life in a tribe or in a savage time would be like. And she thinks that there really are, and there have been historically throughout the world, there have been small groups of isolated people that had almost no education and almost no systematized approach to knowledge, and she was horrified by that. And I mean, I used to live in Bolivia, and so I'm familiar with the mindset of what it would be like to live in extreme poverty and to be extremely isolated from educating influences or civilizing influences. And sure, it's a limited mindset. That doesn't mean that people don't know the axioms implicitly. It doesn't mean that they don't know that a thing is what it is. And so the question facing all civilizations at whatever level, whether it's a tribe or a nation or whatever, is, are we going to be honest? Are we going to seek the truth? And some civilizations do a better or worse job at inculcating the necessity to seek truthfulness, to speak clearly, and to not try to weasel your way out of responsibility, to accept responsibility for things. Those are the things that, as a Christian reading Rand, I appreciate in Rand, is this desire to be so systematic in seeking the truth. Now, if anything, when I look at this discussion of the primacy of consciousness and how, like, in the past, perhaps people had more of an excuse, I could agree with Rand. I could say, in the past, before there was a systematized outworking of, for example, the laws of deduction that Aristotle did, well, if you had a harder time understanding how logic worked, and if you were more susceptible to fallacies, for example, you've seen the Monty Python skit where they think that the person's a witch, and then somebody says, well, she turned me into a toad, and then somebody says, well, I got better. And those kinds of fallacies that are just ridiculous, that we kind of laugh at today. You could perhaps have just a little bit more understanding for somebody that would fall into those. But even then, like, do we think that the people in the Middle Ages were all incapable of knowing their right hand from their left hand? Like, I mean, so from my point of view, the main value in this point that Peikoff is making is that there is an additional culpability when a professor gets it wrong. That's the point that I would take from this.
Well, and I think it raises the question as well, is that how aware do you need to be of a system to have a consistent perspective and outlook on the way you go through life? Do you have to have your system written down and fully documented to be consistent, or can you just go through life and be consistent without having built a specific framework and documented that framework to look at it every day and follow it, you know?
So there have been people that have been systematic, careful thinkers before they had any exposure to philosophy, or they just never had access to it for whatever reason. Yeah, the real value in what Rand is accomplishing here with presenting a systematic approach, I believe, is if you are in the academic world and you are exposed to small, slogans of thought that seem to just unravel your ability to think logically. And you can hear that if you ever look at her address to the graduates at West Point. It's an essay called Philosophy Who Needs It, or a presentation. And she just lays out all these different slogans that ultimately trace back to Hegel or to Hume or to Kant or other people like that, Rousseau perhaps. And these little memes that collect in our minds that we so often regurgitate without having processed them, she allows us to understand where they came from. Mm-hmm. And that's helpful because we live in a time of ideological warfare where you have to have your defenses up in a way that you wouldn't if you lived in a society where the teachers were all philosophically consistent and reasonable, or that they hadn't just developed these layers and layers of weapons against rationality. That's hopefully that gets to it. Andrew, I saw you raise your hand.
Yeah, I want to add an answer to Randy's question using a couple of scriptural quotations. They're really short, but this idea is actually present in Scripture. And I think it's present in the prophets and in the New Testament. In John 9, after Jesus heals a blind man, he uses a metaphor and says, I came into the world so that those who do not see may see, and those who see may become blind. Some of the Pharisees near him heard these things and said to him, are we also blind? And what comes next is this principle that Cody just said. Jesus said to them, if you were blind, you would have no guilt. But now that you say we see, your guilt remains. Meaning, if you really didn't know, if you really hadn't studied this, you would be less guilty. You would be guilty of less malice because it could be excused by ignorance. But because you have studied this, and because you say we see, because you claim to be those who have knowledge, you are worse off. You have more guilt because you've studied it. You have less of a reason to be ignorant of it. And then there's also I'll just summarize this other one. Is in 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 20. Essentially says, if after these false teachers have come to know God and come to know Christ, and then they fall back into their false teaching, the last state has become worse for them than the first. And Scripture is not a philosophical textbook, so it's just mentioning these ideas, but it's implicit in this that the more knowledge you have, the less excuse you have when you distort it. And so I think that's worth mentioning, that especially as we're seeking to construct what is good out of these ideas with an understanding of the truth of Christianity.
Andrew, thank you for that. It also reminded me of the passages that describe how teachers are held to a higher standard, because when you set yourself up to proclaim the truth to other people, that's an additional accountability there. And that's actually the problem that's going on in our society today with our professors, our politicians that have set themselves up to be the leaders. You can understand how they have fallen into their ignorance, and you can have some sympathy, but they ultimately did make a choice, and that choice is affecting other people, and for that they're accountable. All right, Jacob had a point that Jacob Brunton had a point that he said, "I'll be right back, but I have thoughts." Jacob, you're welcome to jump in anytime. I'm going to segue to our next topic, which I thought was, how is this social version of the primacy of consciousness that Isaac mentioned, how is this affecting churches today? Isaac, do you want to introduce that as a subject?
Yeah, I think that there was something about it that really just that resonated with me, and that this whole discussion about the primacy of consciousness over existence, and even preceding this section where he talks about the social version, he talks about how, like, you know, how when you put primacy of consciousness over primacy of existence, you know, you kind of give yourself leeway or something to bypass facts. And so, you know, I see this a lot where Christians will, you know, I think you kind of see this in the Christian discussion about the book of nature versus the book of scripture, and the sufficiency of scripture. And, you know, Christians are I think we can say that some are, they'll take their understanding of a piece of scripture even if it contradicts something in nature. Like, they'll go that far because in their mind scripture is scripture, I guess you could say, interprets nature, or is I can't think of the word, is over nature. It has primacy over nature. But I think it's important to realize that scripture and nature, in terms of them being an authority on truth, are equal, and they should be interpreting each other. So if you have scripture that you're reading and it contradicts something in nature, that should tell you that your understanding, the problem isn't with nature, the problem is with your understanding of the scripture. So anyways, that was a little bit, you know, more specifically, the discussion that I was interested in having is like this idea of a social approach to the truth, where, you know, if you're not concerned about facts and studying nature, or, you know, existence exists, just making observations, and that's the objective truth, then I think it becomes this, truth becomes this like consensus-based thing. And, you know, if you want your opinion to win out, you kind of need to go around and like try to get people on your team, on your side. And the idea came to my mind as I was reading this. It's like everybody becomes a politician in a way, where you're trying to win votes to your argument. It's very tribalistic view of the truth. And what you get from that is people like Tim Keller, who's always talking about the different sides to these issues and never actually says anything valuable about what the truth is, and never actually takes a stand on what the truth is.
Let me see.
So any thoughts on that?
There's a hand raised. That's Andrew. Go ahead, Andrew.
Yeah, I wanted to say something about this because I noticed Jacob Karn put a comment in the chat that I think is a good observation, and it ties into what Isaac was just saying. He mentioned Carl Trueman's Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, and he talked about the issues of primacy of consciousness and primacy of existence that are discussed in there in certain terms. And he says that, and so that's true. So Carl Trueman does discuss this, but I wanted to bring up this book because it's a very popular book. What Jacob's talking about there is a discussion of the terms poiesis and mimesis. And really quickly, poiesis is basically this idea that our minds can decide what reality is going to be. And Carl Trueman kind of ties this to the modern kind of gender identity things. Whereas mimesis means, like, as in mimic, what's in my head is going to mimic what's in reality. And that's supposedly objective knowledge. But I wanted to just mention this because Carl Trueman says, I'm going to summarize this. I'm going to skim through this quote. I'm not going to say the whole thing. This is a paraphrase. But he's talking about Alasdair MacIntyre, who he approves of, and says, actions can be morally assessed only in terms of their ends. And he's saying this is objective, but he says, but the process by which we evaluate the end of human actions needs to be understood as one that is socially embedded. In short, individuals don't exist in isolation, they exist in society. And understanding their ends requires understanding that their ends are constituted by that society or those specific communities. So Carl Trueman, yeah, good. It's great that he makes a distinction between the primacy of existence, mimesis, versus the primacy of consciousness, which he calls poiesis. But he still explicitly says, we get that socially. We get that from looking at other people, and we all decide what that is. And so I wanted to mention that Trueman does not escape that. And his book, the influence of his book right now and the popularity of his book, I think, is evidence of that issue that Isaac was bringing up.
It sounds like he's identified the problem. And one of the problems is what he calls expressive individualism, which is that people think that they can be cats if they want to. And he says the solution is, no, the standard is your society.
Yeah, the problem is that Trueman and many conservatives have they have linked the self with the subjective, and they're just laser focused on that. And so in their minds, anything other than the self is the objective, which has led to them equating the collective with the objective rather than reality as the objective, right? So we would say reality is that which is objective, whether the self recognizes it or not, or whether 1,000 selves recognize it or not. But conservatives are so obsessed with denying self and linking the self or the individual to what is subjective that they end up diving headlong into the socially subjective. And they think that the ironic thing is they think that they're combating leftists by doing it, right? I mean, leftism is all about social subjectivity. They happen to also have individual subjectivity, right? With the, you can be trans or you can be a cat or whatever if you want to. But most of their individual subjectivity on the left is rooted in a deeper social subjectivity, which conservatives are running to, thinking that they're combating the leftists in doing so.
Let's go to Jacob Karn. I saw you raise your hand.
Yes, I'm realizing I probably should have posed it as a question in the chat for the hosts and panelists to maybe brew some discussion. I was asking because I'm currently at a seminary right now, and for a lot of the modern apologetics and a lot of the modern kind of church history courses, a lot of Trueman's influence of his, well, specifically his book, but also his just take on culture and society. I've spoken with some of the students about it, and I wanted to hear your take specifically on that issue, because and it's the same in politics as well. You could say a lot of conservative politicians think that they're battling leftism, when in reality, it's just a baptized version of leftism in conservative terminology. And it doesn't really solve the issue because it still is operating in the same sort of assumptions, kind of like how you could say Trueman is still operating with the idea of social determination rather than just individual determination, but that's still relative and subjective to a degree. So
well said. And anybody who has read much about what Hegel said, you'll understand that what the conservatives are doing now is it traces back to Hegel, and before that to Kant. And it's what they're doing is they're trying to offer a solution to skepticism, because remember, David Hume historically made a strong case for skepticism, or at least what was perceived to be. And then Kant comes in and says, well, no, here's the alternative. Here's why you don't have to fall into skepticism. Here is my proposed solution for how we know things. And it was the social subjectivism, the social theory, the social primacy of consciousness. And Hegel develops that much further, because he says, well, if that's true, well, then what is the most important social unit? And he says it's the state. And then he goes on to say that the state is the determiner of what is true. And oh man, can you see that today? And this is a section that I'll read from page 22. I mean, just keep in mind that this was written like 1991 or so, but listen to what it says. Knowledge is said to rest on the consensus among thinkers, like, quote, the science. Like when people say the science, they mean the consensus among society, right? And so Peikoff goes on, a consensus that results not from each individual's perception of external reality. So your individual perceptions about whether or not this cause led to this effect, whether or not this is a necessary solution to this problem, your individual perceptions are discounted because it's the experts, the consensus, the state is telling us what is true. So he says, a consensus results not from each individual's perception of external reality, but from subjective mental structures or contents that happen to be shared by the group's members. We hear on all sides that there are no objective facts, but only human truth, truth for man, and lately that even this is unattainable, since there is only national, racial, sexual, or homosexual truth. In this view, the group acquires the omnipotence once ascribed to God. What he's describing there, we now refer to as standpoint epistemology and the critical race theory method of knowledge and the intersectionality method of knowledge. All of this, he was talking about when I was just, he's talking about 30 years ago.
Or presuppositionalism.
Oh, explain.
Just the idea that all facts have to be interpreted through a presupposed grid, right? I mean, that was Kantianism. The idea you can't get to reality in itself. You have a presupposed grid in your mind, whether it's individual or social, and everything gets interpreted through that. There's no escaping your presuppositional circle. There's no escaping your truth. There's no escaping your standpoint, right? All of these are just different terminology and different ways of saying the same basic Kantian postmodern nonsense.
Yeah, and for more on that, we would probably commend the videos by both Bill Roach and Josh Summer that were both posted yesterday for more. If you want to know more, I'm not saying that we would agree with everything they said. I don't know anything I would disagree with having watched them, but those will give you context on what Jacob just said.
Yeah, I agree with that. Definitely check out those videos. And so go to page 20 in your book. This is a section where in my in the margin I just wrote Van Til. So this is Peikoff is discussing the idea that knowledge comes from revelations. And as you know, this is a topic that at christianintellectual.com, Jacob and I have discussed a lot. General revelation, special revelation. What is the role of these two things in man's knowledge? And I don't agree with everything that Peikoff believes about these topics, but listen to what he's saying here. So he talks about intuitions, revelations, innate ideas, innate structures. He says, in relying on such elements, the knower is not, he feels, cavalierly ignoring reality. He is merely going over the head of existence to its master. Whether human or divine, he is seeking knowledge of fact directly from the source of facts, from the consciousness that creates them. Now, I wouldn't characterize this as, I wouldn't say, oh, it matters so much that it's the consciousness that creates them. But for whatever reason, I do see that what the presuppositionalists are trying to do is to go over the head of the facts and to trace it back to the source of all knowledge. And they have this strong desire to do it. And therefore, you have to posit innate ideas, or you have to posit there's revelations. Like they would say natural revelation, but when they speak of natural revelation, they do not mean the created world. They mean the structure of your mind. That's what they're talking about. And then, of course, how the structure of your mind engages with the created world. But they're much more focused. If you look at Jeffrey Johnson, Owen Strachan, James White, this new presuppositionalist school that that is developing, this new Van Tillian consensus, that it's, from the point of view of those who have studied the history of philosophy, it's just cringy. And what is happening in here is exactly what Peikoff is describing. What is happening to the trends in Christian thought are exactly what Peikoff is describing. And for that reason alone, we ought to be considering understanding what Peikoff's point of view is on this. Even if we disagree on certain things, I think there's value in it. And so I would say, for the close of our video today, one thing that I want to ask is, and then we can do a closing section here. We have maybe 5-10 minutes. What are the benefits that we got from this reading this week for Christianity? What are the solutions that you see in here that we're going to need in our society and in our churches? I'll leave anyone that wants to jump in.
Let me bridge between those two topics by just pointing out there's a real sense in which presuppositionalism is primacy of consciousness. That they do, implicitly at least, place God's consciousness above his existence, his will above his nature. Right. And I mean, sometimes they're even hesitant to say that God is incapable of doing illogical things, because in their minds, oh, now you're placing logic above God. Right. So they want his consciousness, his will, to be above his nature. And the way that they wouldn't say it that way, but they would say above logic. But that translates into being above his nature. And that cashes out in what you were talking about, Cody, where they want to go above the facts, because on the view where existence is primary, God's existence is primary to his consciousness. But then when he creates as a conscious existent, when he creates other existence, he creates them with objective natures, which even he cannot violate. Right. And that's not what a miracle is. If we want to talk about that later on a separate discussion, maybe later, we can. But a miracle is not a violation of a thing's nature. It's you could say it's a violation of the normal way that things interact with other things. But it's not a violation of a thing's nature. God cannot create a square circle, and he wouldn't try to. But in their minds, that's anathema. We can't think of things having fixed natures. We have to think of it's just God's whim. Everything that exists is just God's whim, and it could just as easily be otherwise. And so that's part of the motivation for why they want to go above the facts to the consciousness. And you know, they even say, you know, because all facts have to be interpreted, you have to go to the original interpreter. God's the ultimate interpreter. He's got the ultimate interpretation, but it's still all interpretation. It's still all consciousness prior to existence, whether it's God's own existence or the existence of the things that we're talking about.
Appreciate you adding that, Jacob. Super clarifying. Other thoughts related to what Jacob just said, or just about the general value of this material for Christians?
I think for me, something that I struggled with a lot, a year or two ago, was the idea that I have a sense for something that is true, and I understand it as true. And there's nothing that and I've searched and I've applied myself, and I can't figure out why it wouldn't be true. And at the same time, there's a lot of people who disagree with me. And it was difficult for me to reconcile that, because I think, at least in my Christian world growing up, I was taught that to do such a thing, to be so bold as to declare a thing as true when so many people disagree with you, especially if those people are older and wiser than you are, to do such a thing is prideful. And that struggled with me. That was a struggle for me, because I actually, I didn't know how to think about that. And I think that this book very clearly shows you why it's okay to be an individual and see and understand something, even though many people disagree with you. And I think the example of the volcano is a decent one. If you see the volcano coming towards you and you're about to be consumed by the lava, you better run away. And you should warn people, but don't stick around for too long lest you be consumed. Even if everybody else says, no, it's not going to destroy us, it doesn't matter, it will. And I actually think Ayn Rand does a better job of explicitly stating this. Peikoff kind of got there, he got close. He said that ignoring an entity does not make it vanish, and that's true. If we take the volcano example, ignoring the volcano coming towards you, it doesn't make it vanish. But to make it more explicit, and Ayn Rand does this, in my own words, I said, ignoring an entity does not make the consequences of ignoring it vanish. You may be able to erase your awareness of the entity from your mind, but that will not stop the volcano's lava from consuming you.
Thank you for that, Isaac. That it does remind me of a Rand quote where she says something about you're free to ignore reality. You're not free to ignore the consequences of reality, something like that.
Exactly.
Well, I will give one other piece of feedback about the application of this material to Christian faithfulness and living as a Christian. The year was 2015, and I had just started my website, and it was codyleibel.com or maybe some other URL at that point. But at the top of it, it said Christian individualism, because I realized I wanted to teach Christians about individualism as a concept. Compare what you see in Carl Trueman's book about the modern self and how they derogate individualism. Well, I had been reading in Christianity Today, and I'd been reading about I'd been reading throughout the landscape of Christian thought about the reception of this concept of individualism. And I realized that everyone was attacking it, whether they were purportedly conservatives or moderates or leftists, radical leftists. They were against individualism, and they were treating individualism as if what it meant was the idea that I believe it, therefore it's true, or I'm the only one that matters, things like that. And it was frustrating to me to the point where I said, I'm going to defend individualism. And I met with a friend who was going to a church, actually the same denomination as yours, Isaac. And so I have some experience with that denomination. And the friend was an expert in online blogging and SEO marketing and stuff, and he was going to give me some advice on my website. And so we sat down at a diner, and I showed him what I was working on. And I said, yeah, this is what I want my site to be about. It's about individualism from the Christian point of view. And he looked at that and he said, well, don't you realize that John Piper and C.J. Mahaney and all these other people that are experts, don't you realize that they've rejected that? And I said, yeah, I think they're mistaken. And I'm going to try to argue from the Bible about why this concept matters. And he says, how prideful is that? And this is my friend, just, helping me with my website. And he just looks at me out of the blue, cold clocks me. How prideful is that? And I tried to graciously move the subject along, but we weren't friends after that. That's what's going on in the lives of Christians, is that we can't think for ourselves because we're treated as if we're inferior.
Yeah, and the reality is I think that he's being prideful when he says that. When he claims that you're being prideful, he's speaking from ignorance. He's merely saying, well, John Piper and these other people say that you're wrong, so you must be wrong. It's like, well, let's talk about it. Let's discuss the actual topic. Like, don't you want to know about it? Like, it's prideful to assume that you know something when you actually know nothing about it.
Yeah, he's operating off of a social metaphysic, a social subjective view of truth. And there's nothing more prideful than that. There's nothing more prideful than implying that there is no objective truth to be discovered by individual minds. There's only what the experts or the elites or the majority determines is true. That is pride.
Yeah, we have to stand underneath the truth. And if you choose to stand underneath, something else than the truth, if you choose a different standard than the truth, then you are setting yourself up ultimately as it's true because I wanted it to be, I felt it. And that's, one of the major takeaways of reading Rand is she just doesn't let you have that. She does not let you say it's true because I want it to be. It's because I feel, because it seems right, because I hope. That's not sufficient. It must be objective. It must be based on something outside of yourself. Well, thank you guys for watching the video today. If you would like to, you can join these in the future. You can find it at christianintellectual.com/objectivism. And you're welcome to join live on webinar or share it around on social media. Give the video a like on Facebook or on YouTube, however you are watching it right now. And make sure that you are getting our updates. You can go to christianintellectual.com/subscribe to get our updates. We believe in what we're doing, and it's risky. Saying that you disagree with your entire subculture, when your entire subculture is all you've got in a world that even hates your subculture, is not an easy position to be in. It's intellectually isolating. But you do not have to be intellectually isolated. One of the things I've discovered since I started blogging, 2014, 2015, is that there are other people that have seen the same things. And that is fire to go on. So I will thank you for joining today, and I will see you next Saturday, same time. God bless.